We're here with Ramsey Touchberry, a Capitol Hill reporter for the Washington Times. Ramsey, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So what they're calling the Inflation Reduction Act, I don't know if that's really a good name for this thing based on the stuff that I've seen that's in it, but this is the new bill through reconciliation that Congress is voting on. And all this kind of hinges upon Senator Sinema from Arizona. What's your read on the situation, Ramsey?
Yeah, so Joe Manchin and Chuck Schumer pretty much hashed this thing out behind closed doors over the past few weeks and surprised us with it. The big question is you've got one centrist on board, which is Manchin, but now the question is what's the other one going to do, which is Sinema. And that is what Washington is asking. She has so far been silent on the issue. She says that she wants to wait until the Senate parliamentarian makes a ruling about the bill, which this parliamentarian has to determine if all the provisions can stay in there and be able to be passed along a party line vote. And so we just don't know what she's going to do yet. We know there are a few things that she in the past has been against, but we do know that folks like Joe Manchin and other Democrats are courting her, but so are Republicans. Republicans are having conversations with her too, trying to convince her not to support this.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, the problem here for Democrats is you have the 50-50 Senate, so even one single vote, like Senator Sinema, can completely derail this bill. Obviously, they're passing it through reconciliation, so that means you don't have that higher vote threshold there. But can we talk a little bit about what's in it? You talked about how Sinema is concerned about some of the things in the bill. I'm looking at a 15% corporate tax rate. Obviously, with stuff like that, falls back on consumers. Another $125 billion for the IRS to start looking into small businesses. You got kind of like Green New Deal light, if you want to call it, but another close to $400 billion for climate priorities there. And I think overall around $700 billion in new tax hikes. A lot of things in there that don't seem to me, I know I'm not an economist or anything, but tax hikes and more spending seems like that would increase inflation. Is that kind of the concern that Sinema might be feeling, just like many Republicans are?
I think it's definitely one of her core concerns. That was a core concern of Manchin. And remember, a few weeks back, we thought this whole process of reconciliation, trying to do this along party lines, was dead because Manchin was so concerned about a 9.1 inflation rate. But the Democrats made further concessions for him to try to persuade him that with new tax revenue, we'll actually end up reducing the deficit over the next decade. And so that's how they come on board. They've got a slight, by their calculations, a slight reduction in the deficit over 10 years at $300 billion. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not a lot, but that's sort of what they're going with here as the argument to counter the inflation narrative. And that Sinema's looking at that. These new taxes, or as Democrats are saying, they're sort of wanting to just enforce what these companies and organizations should be paying. Of course, economists have come out. Some have come out and said, well, this is going to also bleed into sort of your everyday Americans. I think it's interesting that we've had a few days to digest this. It's a 700-page bill. And economists are sort of all over the place on it. I think that speaks to sort of the complexity of this issue when you start getting into taxes, especially with big corporations and sort of an IRS enforcement. Everyone's sort of having a different analysis on how this would impact the economy, which it was sort of surprising why Manchin would support this in the long run, because it's sort of up in the air whether it would actually do anything to combat inflation. And some more reports that Democrats are pointing to that say it would reduce inflation, it would only be a fraction of a percent. Which
even if it is actually that fraction of a percent.
Yeah. And those are just the ones they pointed to. Other forecasts have said it really wouldn't do anything, or it could even make it worse in the long run.
And I know that Manchin said something along the lines of agree to disagree on whether this actually will increase inflation. But you talked about stuff, I think, for pipelines or natural gas or something for Manchin. That's why he got on board with the bill. But it seems like there's through some of these climate priorities, there's just going to be taxes on fossil fuels and natural gas, and it seems like even though he's getting what he wants there, they're still going to there's provisions that he wouldn't agree with in the overall bill, so it kind of evens out there. What's exactly he getting out of this, Manchin?
Yeah, so he is getting assurances that while Democrats can get their clean energy provisions like tax credits and new investments towards clean energy projects, he is getting assurances that there's still going to be federal lease sales for oil and natural gas drilling onshore and offshore, which, as you'll remember, the Biden administration wanted to cut that out. He has assurances in there. For that, he's got assurances for a $6.5 billion natural gas pipeline in West Virginia, known as the Mountain Valley Pipeline, that has been on hold for years, but is almost near completion. And he's got, various provisions in here, well, not in here, but as part of a side deal that says they're going to reform the permitting system for energy projects of all forms, so clean energy and fossil fuel. This is a side deal that Manchin and Schumer struck, where Manchin said, if we're going to do these clean energy provisions, climate provisions, I need to have energy reform, permitting reform, so that these sorts of new domestic production projects are not bogged down for years and years in litigation.
So that's how they got Manchin. What about Senator Sinema? What is she looking for in this, and what is she concerned about? I know I talked about tax loopholes. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, so there's a carried interest loophole that they're closing, essentially, or closing a little bit, I should say. It would benefit, mostly wealthy individuals, but that's something in the past that she has stated she didn't believe was sort of a fair tax measure to handle. She didn't think it should be messed with. Enforcing more taxes on larger corporations, it's something that I think she's got some reserve with. As far as other provisions, we don't really know yet what she is or isn't on board with, because she's still waiting on this Senate parliamentarian to make a ruling. And I think what the concern of Democrats is, after that ruling comes out, that she might come forward with sort of a slew of changes that she wants. But as we know, this was negotiated between Manchin and Schumer. And so there's sort of a balancing act that Democrats are trying to play to get both of these moderates on board.
And you're talking about reconciliation, this kind of arcane Senate process about which provisions of this bill can actually stay in it. Can you kind of explain that a little bit to our viewers? Just what is it? What do you mean by which things can and can't be in this bill? This is more about we're in appropriation season. What actually, what can they actually spend money on here? Is that what we're getting at?
Yeah. Reconciliation is a budget process, and under what's called a Byrd rule, there are certain provisions that you cannot put into a budget bill to pass along party lines because they just aren't related to the appropriations process. And so the concern among Democrats is that some of these climate provisions, some of the healthcare provisions that they're including, they're worried that the parliamentarian might rule under the Byrd rule that these are not really budget related or budget specific measures that can be included in this. And so we saw in recent years, when Democrats tried to do this, I believe there was a provision regarding migrants that was stripped out, migrant protections for migrants that was stripped out. And so, there's various things over the years that parliamentarian, even though they're not elected or anything, they still wield this immense power over whether the party that rules Congress can pass this thing through.
And the parliamentarian's a nonpartisan, a part of the Senate, not from either party there. They're making their own decisions there. But I think overall, President Biden's pretty desperate for a win at this point. I mean, so much of his legislative agenda has been stalled. There's so many ongoing crises, across the country, whether it's the border, inflation, the Afghanistan withdrawal from almost a year ago now. So it seems like he's really trying to get this win with, the quote unquote Inflation Reduction Act, if we really want to call it that. But I've been looking at some recent polling from Scott Rasmussen that's saying that, a majority, 55% of Americans say that we need to cut government spending and taxes, while this bill is kind of clearly doing the opposite. Do you think, obviously he needs a win going to the midterms. If people feel this way, how do you think that's actually going to shake out in the midterms? Do you think it's going to help Democrats at the polls if they pass this bill?
That is sort of hard to say. There's so many partisan politics flying around this thing. It sort of depends how closely voters are tuning in. And voters historically have very short memory when it comes to politics. And so, if they pass this thing in the next few weeks and then you've got a few months before the election, most voters, I would venture to say, would forget about it. But this would mark a major win for President Biden, whose agenda was scuttled essentially last year by Manchin himself.
Yeah.
And so, while Congress has had a few recent bipartisan wins, those were more on Congress. And the president has had trouble both at the Supreme Court level and in Congress getting measures that he wants and he campaigned on getting them through. So this would be definitely a big win for him. But as far as what voters think, I venture to say they won't even remember it by the time they get to the polls.
Mm-hmm. It's just like so many things. Well, Ramsey, thanks for coming on. Obviously, this all hinges on cinema, so we'll have to see how that plays out. But thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.